Welcome to another episode. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Leave a comment and let me know. It's always fascinating to see how these stories travel across the world. And if you find yourself coming back to these journeys, a gentle reminder to subscribe. It helps keep this space alive. Now picture something simple. A single sheet of paper resting quietly on a desk. The way it bends beneath your hand, the faint rustle as you turn it, the subtle grain catching the light. If you lean close, there's even a scent, like an old book or a stack of forgotten letters tucked away in an attic. Paper feels ordinary, so ordinary that we almost forget it's there. But this modest invention has shaped nearly everything we know. It has carried stories, discoveries, and dreams across centuries. Empires, philosophies, and sciences would have faded faster without it, confined to whispers or lost to time. Paper became the bridge between fleeting thought and something that could endure. Fragile, yet powerful. Light, yet transformative. So tonight, let's settle into its quiet history and turn the first page together. If we are to understand the science of paper, we first have to step back in time, to a world before paper even existed. A world where the written word itself was still new, and humanity was experimenting with whatever surfaces nature offered to carry thought beyond the fleeting voice. The earliest great example comes from Egypt, more than 5,000 years ago. Around 3000 BCE, Egyptians began transforming the tall, reedy stalks of the papyrus plant into something extraordinary. Papyrus grew thickly along the Nile's banks, its triangular stalks rising taller than a man. For centuries, it had been used in everyday ways, woven into mats, sandals, baskets, even boats. But someone, somewhere along the river, discovered that its inner fibers could be coaxed into a smooth, flexible surface, perfect for writing. The method was both simple and ingenious. The outer rind of the stalk was stripped away, leaving the pale, pulpy core. This was sliced into long, thin strips, which were laid side by side in rows. Another set of strips was placed crosswise on top, forming a crisscross pattern. The natural juices of the plant acted as a kind of glue, binding the layers together. Pressed under weight and left to dry in the Egyptian sun, the mat of reeds became something new, a sheet of papyrus, light yet durable, smooth enough for a reed pen dipped in ink. This process may sound rustic compared to modern papermaking, but for its time, it was revolutionary. Papyrus was lighter than clay tablets, less fragile than wooden writing boards, and more portable than carving words into stone. It became the medium through which Egyptian scribes recorded everything from sacred hymns to mundane tax records. Across the walls of tombs and the halls of temples, scribes bent over their scrolls, scratching lines of hieroglyphs that told of gods, harvests, laws, and lives. The papyrus scroll became a symbol of knowledge itself. To be a scribe in ancient Egypt was to hold a position of immense respect. Literacy was rare, and those who could command the pen were gatekeepers of memory and law. Papyrus was the vessel carrying those words forward. And yet, papyrus had its limits. Though fairly strong, it was vulnerable to dampness, mold, and tearing. The dry climate of Egypt preserved many scrolls remarkably well, but in more humid lands they decayed quickly. Still, the material spread far beyond the Nile. Through trade, papyrus reached the Greeks and Romans, who adopted it eagerly. By the time of the Roman Empire, papyrus was being exported across the Mediterranean in vast quantities, bales of scrolls stacked on ships sailing from Alexandria. Ah, Alexandria, the city whose very name still conjures the image of a library, perhaps the most legendary the world has ever known. Founded by Alexander the Great and developed under his successors, Alexandria became a hub of learning. At its height, The Library of Alexandria is said to have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, many of them written on papyrus, works of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, ideas gathered from across the known world, all committed to the fragile sheets of reed. And here lies one of the paradoxes of papyrus. It allowed knowledge to accumulate, but it also kept that knowledge precarious. A single spark, a careless hand, or the slow creep of rot could destroy centuries of thought. The fate of the library itself, whether burned, abandoned, or gradually lost, remains debated. But whatever the truth, it reminds us how fragile the foundations of written memory once were. Elsewhere in the ancient world, other materials were tried. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets continued to be used for legal contracts and records well into the first millennium BCE. The Chinese, long before they turned to paper, wrote on bamboo strips and silk. But in the Mediterranean world, after papyrus came another great innovation: parchment. Parchment, unlike papyrus, was not born from plants, but from animals. The skins of sheep, goats, and calves were soaked in lime, scraped clean of hair, and stretched taut over wooden frames. As they dried, they were carefully smoothed and thinned until they became supple writing surfaces. The finest version, made from the skins of young calves, came to be called vellum. This was no ordinary material. A good sheet of vellum was strong, flexible, and, unlike papyrus, resistant to the damp. It could be scraped and reused, and, when ink was carefully applied, it could preserve words for centuries. Some medieval manuscripts on vellum remain crisp and legible to this day, nearly 1,000 years after they were written. The story of parchment's rise is often linked to a rivalry between two ancient centers of knowledge: Alexandria in Egypt and Pergamon in Asia Minor. According to legend, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, jealous of Pergamon's growing library, cut off exports of papyrus to their rival city. Necessity, as it often does, drove innovation. The scholars of Pergamon perfected parchment as an alternative, and it spread rapidly across the Mediterranean world. By the Middle Ages, parchment and vellum had become the standard for serious writing in Europe. Monks in scriptoria across Christendom bent over long wooden desks, laboring by candlelight to copy the Bible, the classics of Greece and Rome, and new works of philosophy and theology. Each page was painstakingly ruled, each letter carefully shaped by hand. Sometimes entire lifetimes were devoted to a single manuscript. But this precision came at a cost. Producing parchment was laborious, and each animal yielded only a limited number of sheets. A single large Bible might require the skins of hundreds of sheep. Vellum was even more costly, a luxury reserved for the most important texts. Knowledge, therefore, remained precious, accessible only to monasteries, royal courts, and the wealthy elite. The average person in medieval Europe might live and die without ever laying eyes on a book. Imagine for a moment the paradox of that time. Knowledge was being preserved more securely than ever before, written onto materials that could outlast generations. And yet, the very expense of those materials meant that knowledge was trapped within narrow circles. The ideas of Aristotle, the laws of kings, the musings of poets, all bound in volumes that only a privileged few could touch. This scarcity gave the written word an aura of sanctity. Books became objects of devotion, treated almost like relics. A manuscript might be adorned with gold leaf, encrusted with jewels, or chained to a lectern in a cathedral. To read was to enter a sacred space, and the surfaces that carried words were as symbolic as the words themselves. And yet, as history shows us, humanity always pushes against the barriers of scarcity. The desire to spread ideas more widely, to make them lighter, cheaper, more abundant, never fully disappears. Papyrus had begun that process. Parchment extended it, offering durability. But both were only stepping stones. Still, it is worth pausing here, in the age of scrolls and vellum, to reflect on how extraordinary these early materials were. For the first time in history, thoughts could leap across centuries. The words of Homer, written on fragile papyrus, could inspire a Roman orator centuries later. The Psalms, inscribed on vellum by a monk in Ireland, could be sung by congregations long after the monk was gone. Writing surfaces were never just neutral tools. They were symbols of continuity, of permanence, of the human urge to remember. Each sheet of papyrus, each stretched skin of parchment, was a promise that what is thought today may live tomorrow. In this way, even before the invention of true paper, humanity had already begun to extend its memory beyond the limits of flesh and voice. Fragile, expensive, uneven, but extraordinary nonetheless. By the time vellum and parchment were firmly established in Europe, something far more transformative had already taken root thousands of miles away. In China, the material we now know simply as paper was quietly being perfected. Its origins are surrounded by legend, but the tradition points us to a single name, Kai Lun. Kai Lun was a court official of the Eastern Han dynasty, serving the imperial court in the year 105 CE. Historical records credit him with refining the process of paper-making and presenting it formally to the emperor. Of course, as with many inventions, it is likely that others had been experimenting with similar techniques for decades before. But Kai Lun's recognition marks a turning point, the moment when paper emerged not as an accident, but as an established craft. The raw materials he used were both ingenious and practical. Unlike papyrus, which required the unique reeds of the Nile, paper could be made from things available almost anywhere. Kai Lun combined mulberry bark, tough and fibrous, with hemp rags, old fishing nets, and other scraps of textile. These were soaked, beaten, and pulped until the fibers formed a slurry. That slurry was then spread thinly across a fine mesh screen, allowing the water to drain away. What remained was a delicate mat of interwoven fibers, pressed and dried into sheets. The genius of this process lay in its flexibility. Any fibrous material could, in theory, be used. Old rags, tree bark, grasses, all could be recycled into paper. This meant the material could be produced widely and relatively cheaply, unbound from the geographic constraints that had limited papyrus. It was strong yet thin, smooth yet absorbent, and, importantly, it could be made in large quantities once the technique was mastered. Over the next centuries, Chinese civilization embraced paper with extraordinary speed. By the Tang dynasty, from 618 to 907 CE, paper had become an integral part of everyday life. It carried Buddhist sutras copied with reverence, government decrees that structured the vast bureaucracy, and poems by Tang poets like Li Bai and Du Fu, whose verses still move readers today. For the first time, writing could spread more freely beyond the elite because the cost of producing texts fell dramatically compared to silk or bamboo. Paper also transformed art. Chinese painters found in it a surface that could absorb ink with subtlety, allowing for brushstrokes that captured not just shapes but spirit. Calligraphy, already a high art, flourished further on paper. The material itself seemed to suit the flowing lines of Chinese characters, each stroke alive with the movement of the hand. By the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279, the possibilities of paper expanded again through printing. The earliest known printed book, the Diamond Sutra, was produced in 868 CE, centuries before Gutenberg's press in Europe. The scroll, discovered in Dunhuang in the early 20th century, contains both text and images, printed from carved wooden blocks. It is a quiet marvel. Words multiplied not by the hand of a scribe, but by the systematic impression of ink on paper. This technology reshaped Chinese society. Books could be reproduced more quickly and more consistently. Education expanded, bureaucracy deepened, and cultural memory lengthened. The Song period even experimented with movable type, pioneered by Bai Sheng in the 11th century, who crafted individual characters from baked clay. Though woodblock printing remained dominant in China for centuries, the concept of movable type would later find more fertile ground in Europe, waiting for its moment. Meanwhile, paper began its long journey westward. Along the great arteries of the Silk Road, merchants carried not just silk and spices, but ideas and technologies. Sometime in the 8th century, paper-making knowledge reached Samarkand in present-day Uzbekistan. The story goes that Chinese papermakers were captured during a battle in 751 CE at the banks of the Talas River and brought their skills with them. Whether or not that exact tale is true, Samarkand soon became a thriving center of paper production. From Samarkand, paper spread to Baghdad by the 9th century. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad had become one of the most vibrant intellectual centers in the world. The fabled House of Wisdom flourished there, where scholars translated Greek philosophy, preserved Persian science, and developed new advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Paper was the silent partner in this golden age, providing the medium that allowed thousands of manuscripts to circulate. The smooth, durable sheets were far better suited for Arabic script than papyrus, and their affordability compared to parchment meant that knowledge could spread with unprecedented reach. By the 10th century, paper mills dotted the Islamic world, from Damascus to Cairo to Cordoba. Each region adapted the craft to local materials: linen rags in one place, flax or hemp in another. Techniques improved, including methods of polishing sheets with smooth stones to make them ideal for ink. The Quran was copied onto paper, as were treatises on algebra by al-Khwarizmi, medical works by Ibn Sina, Avicenna, and astronomical tables by al-Battani. Paper became a vehicle of cultural synthesis, preserving ancient Greek works while carrying forward original Islamic thought that would later return to Europe as sparks of the Renaissance. By the 11th century, paper had crossed into Moorish Spain. Factories in places like Toledo and Valencia became the first footholds of papermaking in Europe. Slowly, the new materials spread northward. In Italy, mills appeared in the 13th century, particularly in Fabriano, a town that would become famous for refining techniques like watermarks. By the 14th century, paper was competing directly with parchment across much of the continent, but the transition was not smooth. Europe had long been dominated by parchment guilds, powerful associations of craftsmen whose livelihoods depended on the laborious preparation of animal skins. These guilds resisted paper, sometimes spreading doubts about its quality. Early critics called it cheap and unreliable, worrying that it would decay faster than vellum. There was even a sense of disdain. Parchment, after all, was costly and prestigious, while paper seemed humble, even vulgar. Yet necessity often overcomes prejudice. As universities grew in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the demand for books exploded. Students needed textbooks, scholars needed manuscripts, and parchment simply could not keep up with the scale. Paper, abundant and far cheaper, filled the gap. By the 14th century, European scribes were copying Aristotle, Euclid, and Augustine onto paper. The resistance of the parchment guilds faded, replaced by the practical logic of supply and demand. Still, the true revolution came in the mid-15th century. In Mainz, around 1450, Johannes Gutenberg unveiled his printing press. His key innovation was the combination of movable metal type with a press mechanism inspired by wine presses. With this device, words could be reproduced rapidly and consistently, but Gutenberg's invention would have been almost meaningless without paper. Parchment was too expensive and too slow to produce in the quantities required. Paper, on the other hand, was plentiful, uniform, and perfectly suited to absorb ink under pressure. The result was a marriage of technologies that changed the world. Gutenberg's famous 42-line Bible, printed in the 1450s, became a symbol of this shift. Though some copies were printed on vellum for wealthy patrons, the vast majority were printed on paper, making them far more affordable. For the first time, books could be produced in hundreds, even thousands of copies. Literacy spread, ideas spread. Reformation, Renaissance, and scientific revolution all followed in the centuries ahead, each carried, quite literally, on sheets of paper. Consider the profound change in scale. A medieval scribe might take months, even years, to copy a single Bible by hand onto vellum. Gutenberg's press, combined with paper, could produce dozens of pages in a single day. The bottleneck of knowledge transmission was broken. Europe entered an age of print, where pamphlets, treatises, and eventually newspapers circulated ideas with astonishing speed. This was not merely a technological shift, but a cultural one. The very relationship between people and knowledge began to change. Before, books were rare treasures, guarded in monasteries and universities. After, they became commodities that could be bought, shared, argued over. Political ideas gained traction. Religious debates spread like wildfire. Scientific discoveries traveled from scholar to scholar with new immediacy. Paper was the silent enabler of this transformation. By the dawn of the modern age, paper had become the invisible foundation of human thought. And what is remarkable is how resilient the invention proved to be. From Kai Lun's pulp of mulberry bark and fishing nets to Gutenberg's mass-printed Bibles, the essence of paper remained the same. A mat of fibers pressed flat, holding ink in place. It was simple, adaptable, and endlessly powerful. Looking back, it is tempting to see the invention of paper as inevitable, but history is rarely inevitable. Papyrus might have persisted longer. Parchment might have remained dominant. Without the spread of paper along the Silk Road, without the openness of Baghdad, without the mills of Moorish Spain, Europe might never have been prepared for the printing revolution. And without Gutenberg's press, paper might have remained a humble convenience rather than a civilizational force. Yet the two met, and the world was never the same. By the time Gutenberg's press had made books an everyday reality, Europe was already standing at the threshold of another revolution, this time not political or religious, but scientific. And at the center of it all was paper, quiet and unassuming, yet indispensable. Think of the scientific revolution not just as a series of brilliant individuals, Galileo peering through his telescope, Kepler tracing the paths of planets, Newton watching an apple fall. It was also a revolution of communication. Observations had to be written down, diagrams sketched, data tables copied, letters exchanged. None of this could have flourished without cheap, abundant, and reliable paper. Galileo Galilei, in the early 17th century, kept notebooks filled with sketches of the moon's craters, drawn as he observed them through his telescope in 1609. Those drawings, preserved on paper, carried proof that the heavens were not the perfect crystalline spheres imagined by Aristotle, but scarred and mountainous like Earth itself. His letters, written to fellow scientists, to church officials, to students, spread his ideas far faster than oral debate ever could. Johannes Kepler, working in Prague at the turn of the 17th century, covered paper with painstaking calculations. His laws of planetary motion, which showed that planets move in ellipses rather than perfect circles, were the fruit of endless pages of arithmetic scribbled by candlelight. Without paper, those numbers might never have been kept straight, let alone checked and rechecked. And then Isaac Newton, perhaps the towering figure of them all. Newton's Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, is remembered for its formidable Latin text and dense mathematics. But beneath the published book lay years of personal notes, experiments with prisms, drafts of equations, sketches of orbits, all carried out on humble sheets of paper. Even the famous apple story, whether true or myth, is tied to notes Newton jotted down about the force of gravity, trying to capture a fleeting thought before it slipped away. Paper gave permanence to these flashes of insight. A spoken conversation might vanish. A chalk diagram on a board might be erased. But a diagram inked onto paper could be folded, mailed, preserved, studied again by another mind hundreds of miles away. Science, more than almost any other human endeavor, depends on repetition and verification. Paper became the medium that allowed data to be circulated, tested, and refined. By the 17th century, scientific journals had begun to appear, collections of papers, quite literally, in which discoveries could be shared. The Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, first published in 1665, was the world's first scientific journal. It gathered together letters, experiments, and diagrams from across Europe, printed and distributed on paper. For the first time, there was a regular channel by which knowledge could spread, not just through word of mouth or solitary books, but through a community of readers and writers bound together by the page. It is difficult to imagine the acceleration of human knowledge in this period without paper. The telescope, the microscope, the experimental method, all of them found their voice, not just in instruments, but in the inked lines on paper that allowed discoveries to travel. Paper was the silent backbone of the scientific revolution, supporting every law, every experiment, every hypothesis that shaped the modern world. As centuries passed, the demand for paper grew exponentially. By the 18th century, literacy was rising, commerce demanded contracts, and governments demanded records. The old method of making paper by hand, dipping screens into vats of pulp, one sheet at a time, could no longer keep up. A new industrial age demanded industrial methods. The breakthrough came in the early 19th century with the development of machines like the Fourdrinier, invented in England. The Fourdrinier machine mechanized papermaking. Instead of individual sheets, pulp was poured onto a continuously moving belt of fine wire mesh. Water drained away, rollers pressed the fibers together, and a seemingly endless ribbon of paper emerged, ready to be cut into sheets. This was papermaking on a new scale, faster, cheaper, more uniform. Equally important was the shift in raw material. For centuries, paper had been made largely from recycled rags, linen and cotton fibers beaten into pulp. But as demand exploded, the supply of rags became insufficient. Innovators turned to wood. By the mid-19th century, chemical processes allowed wood pulp to be broken down into fine fibers suitable for papermaking. Suddenly, forests became reservoirs of potential sheets. The world's appetite for paper could finally be matched by production. The effects were profound. Newspapers became daily companions for millions. In London, the Times began printing on paper made by the Fourdrinier machine as early as 1814. Pamphlets, posters, and advertisements multiplied. Political ideas that once spread slowly by hand-copied tracts now surged through societies in mass-printed broadsides. Paper democratized not just knowledge, but also participation. Ordinary citizens could read the news, follow debates, and form opinions. Literacy became not the privilege of the elite, but an expectation for the many. Democracies thrived on this foundation because a voting public needed access to information. Revolutions were carried on paper as much as on the barricades. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, both were stoked by pamphlets, newspapers, and printed declarations. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies in just a few months, a staggering figure for its time. Possible only because paper was cheap and printing presses were running at full tilt. By the 19th century, the power of paper extended even further. Railways carried newspapers across continents within days. Telegraph lines spread the headlines, but it was still paper that delivered them into people's hands. Science, politics, literature, and art all flourished in this expanding ecosystem of print. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, published in 1859, spread its evolutionary spark around the globe not by word of mouth, but by the thousands of printed pages read in parlors, libraries, and classrooms. The transformation was not without challenges. The acidity of wood pulp paper, for instance, meant that many 19th century books and newspapers are now crumbling, yellowed, and brittle. Librarians today face the daunting task of preserving archives printed on material that was never meant to last so long. And yet, even fragile paper served its purpose in its time. It carried ideas forward, generation to generation, faster than any medium before it. It is humbling to realize how deeply entwined the story of modernity is with the story of paper. Without cheap, repeatable sheets, there might have been no Newtonian physics widely circulated, no Enlightenment salons debating printed essays, no explosion of literacy in the 19th century. Paper was the quiet infrastructure on which revolutions of thought and society were built. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrial papermaking had become so efficient that paper was everywhere. Schools were filled with textbooks, cities plastered with posters, shops stacked with catalogues. Even in households, the presence of newspapers, diaries, and letters gave ordinary people a way to participate in the broader conversation of their time. Paper had become, in every sense, the common fabric of modern life. By the dawn of the 20th century, paper had so completely saturated daily life that it was hard to imagine a world without it. Newspapers rustled on every breakfast table. Ledgers filled the offices of banks and factories. Children learned to read and write on lined pages in crowded classrooms. To be modern was to live surrounded by paper, to fold it, scribble on it, pin it to walls, tear it into scraps, carry it in your pocket. And yet, the 20th century also brought questions about paper's future. With each new technology, people wondered whether the reign of the printed sheet might finally come to an end. Radio in the 1920s seemed to promise an age when news and stories could reach ears directly, without paper. Television in the 1950s deepened that feeling. Voices and moving images now crossed the airwaves, bypassing the need for print. By the late 20th century, computers arrived, glowing with the promise of a paperless office. And still, paper endured. For while sound and screens could dazzle, there was something about the tactile, portable, markable sheet that technology could not easily replace. A contract still needed to be signed in ink. A student still learned by scratching notes onto a page. A newspaper still carried a ritual of folding and flipping, ink-smudging fingers in the morning light. At the same time, the sheer scale of paper production reached heights that would have astonished Cylon or Gutenberg. By the 1960s, global paper consumption had reached over 100 million metric tons per year. In the decades that followed, the figure tripled, driven by packaging, publishing, and office use. Forests were harvested on industrial scales. Pulp mills rose along rivers, and paper became not just a cultural tool, but a commodity at the heart of modern economies. The science of papermaking also advanced. Chemists learned to treat wood pulp to reduce acidity, creating acid-free paper that could last for centuries without yellowing. Engineers improved recycling methods so that newspapers could be pulped and reborn as new sheets. By the late 20th century, paper recycling bins appeared on street corners, part of a growing awareness that our relationship with paper was as much ecological as cultural. In this sense, paper has always mirrored humanity's choices. In times of abundance, it multiplies: newspapers, advertising flyers, endless office printouts. In times of reflection, it becomes precious: diaries, letters, books bound to last. Paper is both ephemeral and eternal, tossed away in one moment, treasured in another. And even as screens have grown dominant in the 21st century, paper has not disappeared. Instead, it has shifted roles. E-books and online articles carry convenience, but printed books continue to sell in the hundreds of millions each year. Surveys suggest that many readers still prefer paper for deep reading, the feel of the page, the ease on the eyes, the subtle sense of progress as pages turn. Schools, too, have found that students often learn better when they write notes by hand, rather than typing on laptops. The physical act of pen on paper seems to anchor memory more firmly than keystrokes. There is also resilience in paper that digital media struggles to match. A printed letter can last centuries without electricity. A handwritten notebook can survive a power outage, a hard drive crash, even the collapse of entire technologies. Libraries still guard paper archives, not only for tradition, but because ink on cellulose fibers remains, in many ways, the most stable medium we know. At the same time, paper's role has expanded into the packaging that underpins modern commerce. Cardboard boxes, paper bags, corrugated sheets, they carry our goods across continents. In the age of online shopping, every delivery on a doorstep is wrapped in the science of pulped wood. The humble sheet has diversified into endless forms: tissue, filter paper, currency, art supplies, cardboard, and more. Each is a variation on the same principle Kailun demonstrated nearly 2,000 years ago: fibers beaten, suspended, drained, and pressed. And then there is the symbolic role of paper in our lives. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, diplomas, passports, the milestones of identity still live on sheets, stamped and signed. Even in an age when digital signatures exist, the sight of ink on paper carries a weight of authenticity. A digital file can be altered invisibly. A paper document wears its age, its creases, its stains, like proof of a life lived. In the quiet moments of daily life, paper is still there too. A notepad by the bedside for a sudden thought. A handwritten letter slipped into an envelope, carrying emotion across distance in a way email rarely matches. A paperback novel read on a park bench, pages fluttering in the breeze. These are not just uses. They are rituals, anchoring us to something tangible in an increasingly intangible world. Of course, the future of paper is still uncertain. Environmental concerns loom large. Paper production consumes vast amounts of water, energy, and trees. Though recycling helps, it cannot keep pace with rising demand for packaging and disposable products. Some envision a world where paper is increasingly reserved for what matters most: books, art, archives, while everyday transactions move fully onto screens. Others argue that paper will adapt, becoming more sustainable, produced from bamboo, agricultural residues, or even recycled textiles in ever more efficient cycles. Whatever happens, paper's past reminds us of its extraordinary resilience. It has survived challenges before. Papyrus gave way to parchment. Parchment yielded to paper. Paper was threatened by radio, television, and digital screens, yet still it endures. Perhaps it will not vanish, but simply shift again, finding new roles as human needs evolve. What is striking, as we look across its history, is how consistently paper has been the silent partner in humanity's greatest endeavors. It preserved the wisdom of ancient Egypt, carried the scriptures of Buddhism and Islam, fueled the Renaissance and scientific revolution, spread revolutions of politics and democracy, and continues today to shape education, commerce, and memory. Paper rarely takes the spotlight, but without it, so much of what we know, so much of who we are, would be impossible. Tonight, as you drift into rest, you might imagine the soft rustle of a page turning somewhere far away, in a library, a classroom, a printing press, a quiet study. That sound connects us across time, to scribes pressing reeds onto papyrus, to monks illuminating vellum, to printers cranking Gutenberg's press, to scientists jotting equations in notebooks, to you now, perhaps holding a book or listening with eyes closed. Paper is fragile, it burns, it tears, it yellows. And yet it is also enduring, because it carries what is most enduring in us, our thoughts, our stories, our need to be remembered. So even in the digital glow of today, let's not forget the humble sheet. The quiet invention that, more than almost any other, shaped the story of human civilization. And so, from reeds along the Nile to glowing screens in our hands, the story of paper has followed us, quiet, adaptable, and enduring. It has carried the voices of emperors and poets, scientists and dreamers, and it still carries ours today, in every note, every letter, every page turned. As you rest now, think of the thousands of hands that once pressed fibers into sheets, copied words by candlelight, inked diagrams, or folded pages into books. Paper has always been more than material. It is memory itself, pressed thin, waiting to be read again. Wherever you are tonight, may the rustle of pages stay with you, like a soft reminder of all the stories that came before and all the ones yet to be written. Thank you for listening and for being here. If you've enjoyed this time together, remember you can subscribe and share where in the world you are listening from. It's always a joy to see. For now, let the words fade and drift into quiet.